Welcome everybody. So I thought this would be a good time to take a look at some different Chinese fighting knives. The first thing that really comes to mind, or question that might come up, is what's a fighting knife? How is that different than, say, a guitodao? If you look at something like this is definitely what I would call a guitodao. This is like about 24 inches long. It's kind of difficult to really kind of give some sort of specifications and say, oh, well, a guitodao is this, or duanjian is this, and a fighting knife is that. Because lengthwise, you can get some shorter guitodao and longer fighting knives that are pretty much close to the same length. Generally speaking, I would say that around 24, 25 inches, it changes, and that weapon you have in your hand goes from being something like this that I would say is very definitely a guitodao and becomes a fighting knife. But what's the difference? It's kind of like the difference between a hatchet and an axe. If you think about that, the heads are very similar, maybe exact same shape, generally lighter on the hatchet. They're going to be sometimes going to be significantly lighter, but you have that length of handle difference. That makes a big difference in the torque, how much you can really bring the power into it. And so at some point you feel that shifts. A guitodao like this blade really can still give a very solid, robust cut. And when it moves around, it has the feel the same as a longer full-length dao does. It's kind of, its point of balance, that point of percussion. What it feels like as it delivers that blow is the same or very, very close to what a full-length dao of the same form would feel like. When it gets to knives, if we look at, for example, this first example, this is a Hudiedao. And this is not a period scabbard. This is just a resting scabbard that the collector made for it. It was a good idea. But if you look at this Hudiedao, this has a 20.5 inch blade. So that's 52 centimeters. It's 26.5 inches overall. So it's a fairly long, really pretty robust piece that's 67 centimeters long. This particular example, you won't be able to see it here online, I don't think, but you can see that it has a really active pattern welded blade, hardened edge, so it's made of really good steel, but this is definitely a knife. And part of the reason for that is the shape of the blade. When you want to give a P-cut, for example, like this, compared to this blade, and the Hudiedao weighs a little bit more, this one definitely has that kind of percussive cut. You can feel it wants to really dig in out there, whereas the Hudiedao doesn't have that same kind of feeling. So this is a good example of how two blades that are fairly close. I mean, actually, look at the Hudiedao is a little bit longer. This definitely has a knife-like feeling, albeit a big knife, compared to this guitodao. So you see, this is a really good example of two that this one's actually shorter, but still moves and feels like a saber or full-length sword, whereas this moves like a knife. These, of course, were used with the tongue pai shields or any kind of sort of shield. Pai means shield, so this is literally could translate this as a shield knife, and has a very typical shape for those late Qing dynasty kind of blades. One reason why they might have made these instead of full-length knives, or swords rather, this is easier to control. These were given to men who were mostly in militia or irregular forces, not men who were men-at-arms, who were professional men-at-arms, soldiers who were trained and could handle full-weight weapons. Also, probably not so much materials-wise. I mean, obviously, this is going to use about half as much steel as a full-length weapon, but time to make them, crank them out. If you have to arm people quickly during a rebellion, this probably also makes sense. It's also less expensive that way if you can produce them a little more quickly. So these are really more a weapon of the later Qing that you see when you see these things really appearing and being in a wider spread use. But if you look at that shape and think of that shape, you can see where very likely one of the possible places that the shape for, or the most common shape for the Hudiedao. Now, of course, Hudiedao, I think everybody understands it's is a pair of weapons. And I think this is probably the most common shape. The problem with studying fighting knives like these is that you find many more less ratio than you do sabers or jian, Chinese Dao or jian. And the reason for that is really quite simple. Fighting went on in China pretty constantly, one rebellion to the next, to then the revolution, and then the communist revolution, and the war with the Japanese in between. So if you had inherited your father's or grandfather's Pai Dao, you kept using it and eventually just get worn out. Also, after the fighting or between battles, you need something around, at camp to chop wood, to fix things, on the farm, even for butchering animals. This blade shape, another possible origin for this blade shape, is this fairly similar to some common kind of kitchen knives and butcher's knives. So this could still be used around the farm. When I say this seems to be the most common form of the Hudiedao, this general shape, that's based on what we can see now, but we don't really have a very large sample. Sometimes people refer to a civilian version or a military version of these Hudiedao. I think that's really a mistaken identification. Yes, men-at-arms carried these, but they weren't a standard military arm. During the 1860s, where men-at-arms, militia men from these irregular militias, were carrying these Hudiedao. Usually you see them stuck in their belt. But remember, those were not really, they weren't armed by regulation, they weren't set up by the central government, they were set up by local people, local militias, either to defend their village or by literati looking to fight against these different rebellions that were going on. But if you look at those, you can see a commonality of blade form. This next one here, this is a guitodao. It's also called a yuntodao. The guitodao means a demon or ghost head, a dao knife, and yuntodao is a cloud head. So sometimes this shows you how a knife that seemed to be fairly common, you see this style pop up now and then, even though you don't see so many knives surviving to our time, you do see it fairly commonly. I've seen more than one example posted online, for example, but it shows you how, yeah, these weren't standardized because they don't even go by the same name. Some people call it one thing, some people call it another thing. So this is really kind of a knife you would expect either a professional martial artist, whether they're a thug working for a bodyguard agency or a caravan agency, or whether they're in a militia or just a bodyguard for a wealthy patron. This is the kind of weapon that those kind of people would carry. It's for close-in kind of work. And clearly, this is designed for a percussive kind of cut, right? So you can use this curved portion. We're going to see that again when we look at the next piece. And you can see that also here, of course, on the butterfly knives. You have this curved section really here toward the tip. So at distance, or if you're close, it will slash. It will slash if you're out at distance. But if you're a little bit further back from that, you can also deliver a percussive cut. If you're dealing with a staff weapon, you can have a good solid deflection or parry with your edge when it's percussive. You wouldn't do that. Edge on steel is a bad idea. Knives, of course, are different than swords. It's a whole nother discussion. But you can see that a weapon like this is not set up at all for a thrust. It can't thrust well with this. It's a close-in, machete-like percussive kind of weapon. And of course, it has that, just as with the Hudiedao, it has this hook, you could say, for catching, and the nice knuckle bow to protect your fingers. So that's the guitodao. This one has a 14-inch blade. That's 35.5 inches and 19.5 inches long altogether. That's almost 50 inches, 49.5 centimeters long. So not a particularly big blade. You can see, like, that's a knife, right? That doesn't at all feel like a sword does. It feels like a big knife.